Good evening. My name is Donal O'Donnell and I'm the Chief Justice. And it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone here today to this, the second event in our Four Courts 100 lecture series. And tonight's event is entitled National Archives, the Memory of a Nation. It is indeed very appropriate that we are here in the Court of Appeal building, which 100 years ago was the original reading room of the Public Records Office, which was one of the predecessor institutions of the National Archives of Ireland. 100 years ago, this building, along with the rest of the Four Courts campus, was occupied by the irregulars under the leadership of Rory O'Connor. Opinions differed then, and perhaps have differed since, about how welcome those visitors were to the Four Courts. But tonight there is no equivocation. I can say that on my own behalf and on behalf of the judiciary, that the courts and the court service, that everyone is very welcome here this evening. We, in the Decade of Centenaries Committee in the courts and the court service, are very pleased to be collaborating with the National Archives of Ireland, not only on this event, but also across the full programme of commemorations, which will also include an event to mark the enactment of the Irish Free State Constitution towards the end of the year, and which was adopted almost 100 years ago on the 25th of October 1922. Together with the National Archives, we are also coordinating with the Beyond 2022 project to organise a week of activities at the end of June to mark those historic days of the battle and destruction of the Four Courts, and which will include the Beyond 22's launch of the virtual records treasury online. There has always been a strong link between the legal profession, and in particular the judiciary, and the National Archives. I think I speak on behalf of all my colleagues when I say how much we respect and value the work that is done in the archives. I recall very well that I think that it was the first chairman of the National Archives Advisory Council was the late Mr. Justice Niall McCarthy, and that his enthusiasm for the project and his stature both within the legal profession and outside it did much, I think, to establish a firm foundation for the work of the archives and to developing a culture of respect for the dispassionate assembling, maintenance and display of records of historical significance. The present chair of the National Archives Advisory Council continues the tradition of the link between the legal professions and the archives. John Hedigan was called to the Irish Bar in November 1976, was appointed a judge of the European Court of Human Rights in 1998, a judge of the High Court in 2007, and then a judge of the new Court of Appeal on its creation in 2016. So in his case, it's a case of welcome back. Since his retirement from that role, he has been chair of the Irish Banking Culture Board and the chair of the National Archives Advisory Council. And he is going to open this event and then to present four panellists to speak: Dr. Orlaith McBride, the Director of the National Archives, Dr. Natalie Harrower, Director of the Digital Repository of Ireland, Dr. Hiram Morgan, historian and lecturer, University College Cork, and a member of the Advisory Council, and Dr. Elizabeth Mullins, archivist and historian in the UCD School of History. So, John.
Thank you very much for those words, Chief Justice. It's great to be welcomed here by you, and thank you very much for coming along to honour us today. I think we all greatly appreciate the trouble that you're taking. Just very briefly, the role of the National Archives Advisory Council, which I've chaired for the last 5 years, is to advise the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht in the exercise of her powers under the Act and on all matters affecting archives and their use by the public. It was established in January 1987. The format of this evening is that I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to go over to a questions and answer session in which I will ask the panellists that we have here, who have already been, their names have already been mentioned by the Chief Justice, and ask them questions, and then I hope to be able to go to the audience for questions from them. So, without more, the memory of the nation, the National Archives. It is often said that history is written by the victors. I do not believe that that is true. It seems to me, it always has, that what the victors write should be regarded as propaganda until proved otherwise. It usually is just that, although a certain measure of truth may occasionally be discerned in early accounts. Real history is written by historians, and their task is to look behind the early protestations of the victors, or indeed the vanquished, in order to ascertain what really happened. Why, when, who did what, to whom, and for what reasons. This applies broadly to everything from wars to pandemics to all incidents or events where there may be no obvious victor nor vanquished, where society needs to know why, when, how, what did we do, how did we do it, with what effect, and what can we learn so as to do again what was done correctly or do what is necessary to avoid making the same mistakes. Primary sources will be the guiding light and lodestone in this unending search for the truth. It is in the records of the state, carefully compiled, conserved, protected, and maintained in accessible form, that historians will search for those documents and other forms of record that reveal the true picture of how our history has unfolded. The records of the state will also hold the key to all the other areas of our lives where reliable data is essential to the continuance and the structure of a complex organised society. The archives of the state may truly be described as the memory of the nation. The earliest archives, I believe, are those of the Sumerians in the 4th millennium before the Christian era. They kept careful records on clay tablets of matters relating to commercial activity and property ownership. They stored these tablets in rooms irrigated by water channels, so that in the intense heat, the evaporating water would keep the clay tablets nice and moist, and thus less likely to crumble or shatter. In ancient Greece, archaeons were provided in at least 20 polis or city-states to preserve and protect their documentation. Archaea is the ancient Greek for public records, and thus is the origin of the word archive. The most famous of these was the Metroon on the Agora in Athens, which remained in existence from the 4th century to the BCE to the 1st century CE. In Rome, the ruined remains may still be seen of the enormous tabularium, where the archives of Republican and Imperial Rome were carefully stored over long centuries. The care of the records of the state throughout history has been considered essential to the proper conduct of society. Today's archivists face many of the same problems of collection, conservation, preservation, protection, and accession as those of their ancient predecessors in Sumeria, Pharaonic and Ptolemaic Egypt, Greece, Persia, Republican and Imperial Rome, and all the civilizations since. They are indeed a part of an ancient, learned, and a noble tribe. 1702 is one of the key dates in the history of the National Archives. Prior to this date, Lords Lieutenant, upon the expiry of their terms, took the records of their administration away with them. This rather extraordinary practice was of such obvious inconvenience to their successors that it was decided to establish a state paper office in Dublin Castle. This was instituted by Queen's letter directing the keeping of records of all kings' and queens' letters, giving warrants, orders of directions by the justices and their successors, and other petitions and letters. Duplicates or copies of the private letters of the Lords Lieutenant, however, were accepted, an early example of GDPR perhaps. By the time we reach the early 19th century, the Record Tower in Dublin Castle was established as a repository for state papers. It continued to receive periodic deposits of records from the Chief Secretary's Office and other Irish offices of state. Under the Public Records Ireland Act of 1867, the State Papers Department of the Record Tower was made subject to the superintendence of the Master of the Rolls, one of the senior judges in the Four Courts. The keeper of state papers continued to receive, arrange, classify and list all state papers and then deliver them into the custody of the newly established Public Record Office of Ireland, located right here in the Four Courts in its magnificent new quarters. In what must rank as one of the most tragic paradoxes in archival history, by 1919, almost all the state papers from many different sources had been transferred to this magnificent home for the most precious documents in Irish history in order to ensure their safety. These included parish registers and a vast body of documents dating from medieval times, ranging from one end of Ireland to the other. The extent of this holding was meticulously recorded by Deputy Keeper Herbert Wood in his Guide to the Public Records of Ireland, which was published in 1919. Some documents dated back to the 13th century. Between midnight and 1 a.m. on the 15th of April 1922, the anti-treaty IRA occupied the Four Courts building and rapidly took control of all of the Four Courts campus, including the Public Record Office, although not the immediately adjoining Four Courts hotel. The PRO included two adjoining buildings. This building, in which we are sitting today, which was the Record House, including offices and a public viewing room, and right beside it, through there, right beside it, the Record Treasury, where the archives were stored. The two parts were separated by a fireproof link. The occupying force established their munitions factory in the Record Treasury building. The anti-treaty IRA moved their headquarters from Parnell Square to the Four Courts. In the early hours of the 28th of June, following intense pressure from the British government to take control of the situation or face the intervention of the military, the last straw for the provisional government was the kidnapping and the removal to the Four Courts of Free State Army General J.J. Ginger O'Connell by the 18-year-old Sean McBride and his comrade, 24-year-old Ernie O'Malley. Free State forces attacked the Four Courts using artillery provided for them by the British military. The defenders fought fiercely but were overcome by the 30th, which was the last day of the siege. In fact, Commandant Padraig O'Connell stormed this building through a hole in the wall punched by artillery in Hammond Lane and charged through that door over there with his men on that occasion. On this last day, on the 30th, a colossal explosion occurred in a building adjacent to the Record Treasury. This started a fire which was so fierce that it spread through the whole Four Courts campus, destroying almost all of it. In the Record Treasury, where the occupiers manufactured their munitions, the intense fire and resultant explosion of these munitions completely destroyed the building. On the 2nd of July, Deputy Keeper Herbert Wood was one of the first to inspect the scene of utter destruction. His thoughts and feelings can only be imagined. It was not until the 11th of July that Minister of Defence Richard Mulcahy could confirm that the site had been cleared of mines. On the 17th of July, Public Records Office of Ireland staff were allowed onto the site to begin the task of salvaging what they could. Led by James Morrissey, Assistant Deputy Keeper, they gathered up what remained in the rubble. They sorted and identified what they could. In just under a year, they packed 25,000 sheets of paper and parchment into nearly 400 bundles. Everything that was retrieved from the wreckage was wrapped in brown paper, labelled and secured with string. There's a photograph in today's Irish Times of that very thing, of those documents. Following the establishment of the Free State in December 1922, the PROI and the SPO continued to function until the enactment of the National Archives Act 1986. Under this Act, the Office of the Keeper of State Papers and the Public Records Office of Ireland were amalgamated to form the National Archives of Ireland. In 1989, the government assigned premises at Bishop Street in Dublin to the National Archives. The premises of the former SPO and the Record Tower of Dublin Castle was vacated in 1991. The headquarters of the new National Archives was moved from the Four Courts to Bishop Street in 1992. The National Archives continues to maintain storage in the building which replaced the Record Treasury building immediately adjacent to this building, which now houses the Court of Appeal. Today, the National Archives of Ireland is responsible for collecting and safely managing the records of the state. These include records of all departments of state over 30 years old, the records of 61 scheduled bodies, court records, and, of great topical significance, records of tribunals of inquiry or other bodies like that established by the government. It provides guidelines for government departments and the courts on the transfer of records to the National Archives, as well as training to bodies covered by the Act on the transfer of records to the National Archives and their release to the public. Much of the work involves the creation of finding aids, catalogues, to the record holdings, the administration of the online catalogue, and the listing of recent and backlog transfers. The National Archives also provides advice and guidance to government departments and public service bodies on a wide range of matters relating to the safe management of records under their control. The National Archives is also responsible for requests to destroy records that do not merit permanent preservation within the meaning of the Act. Destruction of such records is prohibited without a destruction certificate signed by the Director of the National Archives. The National Archives Public Services section provides a high-quality service to researchers and archive users. This work includes supervision of the reading room, administration of the website and social media accounts, and responding to inquiries from the public regarding its holdings. The National Archives is also responsible for administering requests for copies of archives, supervising the advance order system, facilitating group visits and lectures, assisting the media in requests for filming or photographs of records, dealing with requests for copyright clearance, and administering the professional genealogy service. The Archive Repository and Digital Management section is responsible for the management of all archive storage in the National Archives. This work involves ensuring that archives are stored securely in optimal conditions, that accurate data is kept in order to locate each document, and the management and production of all archives to and from the reading room and reproduction services, including certified copies, licensing, copyright, and permission to publish. They also undertake digitisation projects in the continuing expansion of digitised collections available online. The Conservation Services section ensures the permanent preservation of the archives, working closely together with colleagues to identify and assess damaged collections and to undertake necessary repair work as required. All collections chosen for digitisation must be assessed by conservation to ensure the best quality image can be captured. All newly transferred material must also be assessed to ensure no contaminated archives are allowed into the storage facilities. So we've travelled a long way from Sumeria and the clay tablets. We are, however, in many ways only at the beginning of a new journey. Creating a world-class infrastructure to preserve all forms of records and data remains a key priority. Before the end of this year, a massive building project will commence in Bishop Street, which will transform the existing repository, greatly increasing its storage space and public exhibition space to enable even more and greater public interaction. The focus is to enhance, develop, and deploy physical and virtual infrastructures in order to build a secure footing for Ireland's public record in paper and born digital formats, thus ensuring and promoting their visibility and enabling access in the digital age. Whilst the National Archives will have developed a comprehensive physical infrastructure, it also needs to plan and develop a corresponding digital preservation infrastructure. The National Archives seeks to address this great challenge through collaborative approaches to record making and record keeping in the digital age. The National Archives is facing right now the significant challenge posed by the archiving and preservation of born digital records. These records will be arriving in the next few years in massive volumes by way of electronic government and other records. Just imagine how much of the recent pandemic period records are electronic. How vital it is that they be carefully gathered in, safely stored, and kept readily accessible in an electronic world that changes almost daily. This challenge includes how to store and preserve data, and also how to create workflows to support government departments and agencies to maximise compatibility, as well as converting paper records to digital. This will be a priority over the coming years. In 2011, UNESCO made a universal declaration on archiving. It states that, quote, archives record decisions, actions, and memories. Archives are a unique and irreplaceable heritage passed from one generation to another. Archives are managed from creation to preserve their value and meaning. They are authoritative sources of information underpinning accountable and transparent administrative actions. They play an essential role in the development of societies by safeguarding and contributing to individual memory. Open access to archives enriches our knowledge of human society, promotes democracy, protects citizens' rights, and enhances the quality of life." End quote. Ireland is a small but vital country in our European Union. We cannot afford to be anywhere but at the cutting edge when it comes to the electronically recorded world in which we already live. We are nowhere near that position right now. We are well behind our usual state comparators, such as Denmark and Finland. The National Archives Advisory Council has no executive role. As I said, its role is to advise the Minister on all matters relating to the National Archives. We have advised that Ireland lags behind in facing the challenges that archive services everywhere now face. The consequences of any failure on our part in this regard will be profoundly serious. Delays to the annual transfer of records, the inevitable loss or destruction of records, and other failings may lead to a loss of transparency in the working of the state, and with that, a loss of trust in the democratic process. Various commissions of inquiry have relied heavily on the records of the state, and despite the considerable strain on limited resources, the National Archives have cooperated on all occasions. I should point out that we have also advised that we consider the efforts of the staff of the National Archives to maintain the present service with the limited resources available is little short of heroic. The Council believes, and we have advised accordingly, that there needs to be a thorough reassessment of the role of the National Archives, including its positioning within the government. A new act is urgently required. The world today is completely different to that of 1986. We've called for the establishment of a working group to urgently attend to these concerns. I repeat that call tonight. The National Archives has arisen phoenix-like from the rubble of the Public Records Office of Ireland, a testament to the resilience and determination of its people over the years since 1922. The ambition of the National Archives of Ireland is to be a 21st century archives for a 21st century state. The National Archives Advisory Council is convinced of the esprit de corps, motivation and ambition of all within the organisation to achieve this lofty but essential goal. The National Archives of Ireland must remain central to the development of information management and compliance all the way across the civil service of Ireland, and continue to innovate and develop new services which will ensure the long-term sustainability of the public record. It faces a massive challenge. It can only meet this challenge if it has the resources and the structure to do so. So I think that's enough from me for the present moment, and what I would like to do now is to join the panel and to initiate our discussion, and I have a few questions for them. Orlaith McBride is the Director of the National Archives, and she previously was the Director of the Arts Council, successfully delivering the Arts Council's significant commemoration programme in 2016. And she has been since 2020 the Director. Orla, could I ask you, we've heard now tonight about the origins of the National Archives and its evolution and development over the last 100 years. What does the future look like?
Thank you, Chair. Well, as the Director and amongst my colleagues here, I think for us the future holds huge potential and opportunity, but significant challenges for us. We're here this evening within the context of our Decade of Centenaries commemoration programme, and we have a very successful collaboration with the Court Service, and I see the Chief Executive here and the Chief Justice, and I just want to pay tribute to the working relationship that we've developed over the last number of years, or the last year, and in a way that is emblematic of the way that we see the future for the National Archives, which is that we're reaching out and we're connecting beyond ourselves so that people really do understand and value the work of the National Archives, and also that we can communicate the richness of the collections in a much more animated way. So, for example, this year, as part of the decade, our commemorations programme, we finished last year with a successful treaty exhibition in Dublin Castle, using those records from the foundation of the state. Of course, we're very lucky to have those records at our disposal. They're a huge asset. But it's to animate those through exhibition, through publication, through talks and events, and we will continue that approach over the coming years. So this year we will continue working, for example, with the Court Service in relation to the Constitution Committee, etc. We were very privileged last year that the Collins family loaned us Michael Collins's diaries for 1918, 19, 20, 21, 22. So it's a way now of digitising those diaries and then bringing them to the public in new and interesting ways, and commissioning high quality publications and resources. So in terms of what the future looks like, for me, the first thing is to really begin to communicate outwards, rather than people always coming into the National Archives and seeing it as the reading room, as a resource for academics, historians, legal researchers, the legal profession, etc., or the citizen researcher, people who are interested in their family history, genealogy. It's really about us communicating the role of the archives to the public in such a way that people begin to understand the importance of the National Archives' role in terms of looking after, preserving and conserving the records of the state. So that's the first real, for us, the future is around animating the collections. The second, and you spoke to it, Chair, which is around the building in Bishop Street. So it was the old Jacobs, for people who know it, it's the old Jacobs factory in Bishop Street, and it's a humongous building. It is cavernous, and for my colleagues that are here, I'm in it since 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, albeit, but I still get lost every time I'm in around and about the building. But the state will now invest millions, and that work will start at the end of this year, millions and millions, to provide for us and for the state a state-of-the-art repository. And that investment, that level of investment, is unprecedented. And it comes, I suppose, 100 years after the foundation of the state, and 100 years after this was our search room, our reading room. So for us, it's a huge honour to be here this evening. But that's our working archive behind. So our staff are over and back here every day. So for us to be able to improve where we store our records and how we store our records will be very significant for the National Archives. And then it will allow government departments, because we've said for the last number of years we're closed for business, we cannot accept transfers. So over the next number of years, as the new building is completed, we will then be able to take backlogs, vast quantities of records that have been sitting in government departments, mostly in commercial storage, over decades, that should be and should have been accessioned into the National Archives so the public can have access to them. So that's a huge project in terms of the next number of years. So we talk about, therefore, improving the physical infrastructure, but we also, and you spoke to it, and I think my colleague here beside me will speak to it also, which is around the corresponding digital preservation infrastructure. And that's, as you said, for every archive across Europe, across the world, that's a huge challenge. And as technology changes all the time, how do you keep up with that? So we need to transform how we do business to meet the demands of a digital archive. And that will take significant further investment over the next number of years. So the physical infrastructure, then the digital infrastructure. And then finally, Chair, the National Archives, when I came into it, what I began to realise and understand very quickly was that it's a very complex institution, in that it's a national institution, but also then it's an administrative process in terms of the archival process, but it's also a public facility. So you're managing three distinct threads of work throughout, and each of these functions require different different strategies, different skill sets, different actions. They all complement and they all intersect with each other. So in terms of the future as a national institution, I spoke at the beginning, that's about strengthening the role, the profile, the position of the National Archives over the coming years within the public consciousness, but also across government. That people recognise and understand why government departments transfer records into the National Archives. Secondly then, in terms of the administrative process, and that's that archival process, working with our colleagues in third level, it's really to provide that leadership in terms of records management across government, and then working and supporting government departments and agencies in terms of preserving and conserving hard copy records and digital records. And then finally, in terms of the future, the public facility. It is to ensure that the reading room, how the public access our records, making much more available online. We saw in the last 2 years that people really did pivot towards the digital very quickly. Organisations and institutions responded as best they can, but actually there's huge potential there, so that if you're living in Belmullet or you're living in Ballahadreen or you're living in Listowel, that you can access the services of the National Archives without physically having to come to Bishop Street. So that's the future, I think, in terms of the work that we have, myself and my colleagues, that we've set ourselves over the next number of years.
So you've got a lot of challenges
we do,
and opportunities as well.
Yeah.
And just one thing, is it still possible for people outside Dublin to see the wonderful treaty exhibition?
Yes, the treaty exhibition, as we sit here this evening, is currently in Donegal, in Thurles and in Wicklow, and it will move to Wexford, Cork and Limerick in the coming week. So yes, and then if we haven't scooped up enough people through that regional tour and the very successful exhibition in Dublin Castle, we are bringing it to the Ploughing Championships in September.
Well, anyone that hasn't been to see that exhibition should make a point of not missing it. It's absolutely outstandingly interesting. So could I come to you, Natalie Harrower? Dr. Harrower is the Director of the Digital Repository of Ireland, a certified national trustworthy repository for Ireland's social and cultural data, the collections ranging across the arts, humanities and social sciences. The DRI preserves and provides sustained access to digital data for the long term. Dr. Harrower is currently involved in the development of open science policy and practice in Ireland and Europe, and takes a particular interest in open access to cultural heritage data. Natalie, could I ask you what are the key differences in archiving digital as opposed to material items?
Thank you, Chair, for that question, and hello to everyone here this evening. It's very nice to see you all. I think there's a very good general understanding in the public that paper archives need to be cared for, that they have to be stored in particular conditions, managed over time. But there's a bit less of an understanding around what has to happen with digital records, less understanding about digital archiving in the public. Digital archives are, I would say, a real mixed blessing, because on the one hand, digital material is much more fragile than archives on paper, parchment, papyrus, or any of these other media that you referred to in the history of archives. The cliche statement is that if you want to keep something for 1,000 years, you really should just carve it into stone. Although I was in Glasnevin Cemetery the other day on a beautiful day and noticed all of the names fading off of the tombstones, so don't leave the stone outside. Okay. But digital materials can be lost, they can be deleted accidentally often, and they can be corrupted. So if a paper gets a bit burned around the edges, like you were seeing in the images there, you can still read parts of it. But if you corrupt a digital file in any way, you can't open it at all, right? So digital preservation is really, it's not a single act, much like preservation is not a single act of material items at the archives right now, but it's an ongoing process, and that process is aimed at sustained access. So it's not just about keeping the thing safe, it's about ensuring our ability to access it over time. And this is the kind of significant difference, I would say, and it's a significant task in and of itself. So I said it's a mixed blessing. There's the tough side, but the positive side is that digital materials are much more lightweight. In fact, they have no weight at all, some could say. And they take very little space. And unlike real estate in Dublin or most of the country, the cost of digital storage is actually going down over time. So this is something that's reducing, and it's making it more accessible. And if you combine those kind of elements, those positive things about the digital, with the internet, as Orlaith was saying, the kinds of materials that can be made available online, this really revolutionizes the accessibility of records. So digital objects do require repositories, special kinds of repositories to hold them, and that ongoing care and preservation, so there's a similarity there. But I think the flexibility around the digital has democratized the collection of archives, and especially by different communities and society as well. So there are many community-based archives across Ireland that help to also paint an even broader picture of the world that we live in than can be created by a single archive alone. So I think there's a sort of ecosystem, and the digital is enabling that kind of work to happen in different kinds of ways, because not all archives are records, right? There are other kinds of archives, and I think we need to support that ecosystem of the different archives that are out there. Clearly, the National Archives needs more support as well, but I would like to extend that a little bit broader, because what you find in community archives tell a different story than the one that you see in the archives of the nation, and this, I think, expands on the point, Chair, that you were talking about history not being written by the victors. So I hope that responds to that question. There's many other differences, but those are the key ones.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That's very interesting. And it's also very interesting to reflect upon the availability online in recent years, which you've just referred to, which is very, very interesting. We also have here Dr. Hiram Morgan, who's the historian and senior lecturer at University College Cork. And he's a member of the Irish Manuscripts Commission. He was a founder and co-editor of History Ireland, and when I wrote a little thing about Brian Boru, I remember I relied on some very interesting information that you had there, because there's a family connection we're very proud of. Ireland's Illustrated History magazine it is, of course. He's the director of the very aptly named CELT, C-E-L-T, Corpus of Electronic Texts of Ireland, and is currently working on a biography of one of the most interesting men in Irish history that I think is very, very underrepresented in biographical terms, and that's the great Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. And I, for one, am greatly looking forward to the publication of that.
So am I.
Yeah, true. So can I ask you, Hiram, what is the professional's historian's take on the National Archives?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming here today and for this opportunity to talk about the National Archives. First of all, I think I would like to put my historian's hat on and sort of contextualize the history of the archives to a slightly greater extent. First of all, the important thing for me is that the National Archives of Ireland have their origins in the Public Records Office of Ireland, and the word public is a key word here. Because they were established in the 19th century when political economy and it was the age of political economy, the age of information and statistics, when governments were developing record collection like the census, or individual records like birth certificates, marriage, death certificates. So it was the age of statistics. It was that sort of information to be collected and to put to public use. There was also the widening of information to the public as the franchise was extended to make democracy work. And the public records offices were called public because documents were no longer secret, which was the key. Before the 19th century, documents were secret. They were used simply by officials. Now they were to be made public. Now, of course, in the 19th century, documents didn't become completely public. Really, you had to have a letter of introduction to get in to see the documents. And also, you had to know what you wanted to see, essentially. And that's then when the great work of the deputy keepers of the public archives, the public record office here in the Four Courts comes to its fore. Because although the Public Record Office here was used by scholars, antiquarians, civil servants, legal eagles, people maybe with an eye to politics. These records were all governed by a 50-year rule, but the real work was done by the deputy keepers who transcribed documents, indexed documents, and published an annual report. Now, one of the documents, for instance, that I use quite frequently is the Calendar of Fiends composed by the deputy keepers, and it is a series of grants, licenses, warrants issued during the 16th century, but particularly pardons. And by the end of the 16th century, almost everybody takes out a pardon because they're being accused of treason in one form or other. And the thing is that that operates almost like a telephone directory of the 16th century. And that was the work of the deputy keepers. Now, they fortunately indexed a lot of stuff, but really, when the Public Record Office was destroyed 100 years ago, a lot of stuff here had been centralised. Most of Ireland's administrative records, a lot of legal records, most of the Church of Ireland's documents were. So all this extensive body of legal and church material, which would have provided us with windows into the history of ordinary people, because the legal records often do that, into the everyday life in medieval and early modern Ireland, all of that was unfortunately lost. And that's a great tragedy. But so after independence, really, although some of this stuff remained, really you had essentially a new archive which started to be built, which was the government records of a sovereign state. And really, it was really late in the day that a proper records office was established in Bishop Street in the 1990s, when the remains of the original Public Records Office, the State Paper Office in Dublin Castle, and then what had been accumulated since 1922 went into Bishop Street. And really, you have a second age then in this period, especially from the 1960s onwards, when the access rule is reduced from 50 years to 30 years, you have a golden age of access. And that golden age is really, it's people like myself come through then, the university researcher with the much prized Reader's Pass. And that enables not only historians, but social scientists, and then the people in recent years who have done master's degrees, PhDs, to do dissertations, and all of those people come to the fore. And then in more recent times, with the reduction of the rule to 20 years, you have journalists and other media people coming on site. And so all of that has led to a plethora of history books, and also that great publicity period around New Year when documents are released, which is often documents about the recent troubles in the north, because many of them are Anglo-Irish records. So those are two great ages. The first age in the 19th century up to 1922, really until the end of the 20th century. But I think a new age dawned really at the end of the 20th century, where it was the emergence of what you might call the personal researcher at the end of the 20th century. And this was partly spurred on by the digitization shortly after, at the start of this century, of the 1901 and 1911 census. And by this stage, we've all used and we've all looked up our grannies and grandparents and great-grandfathers and so on and so forth. And that was aided by accessibility through the internet. And then that in turn, so that has allowed the rise of an individual researcher. And many of these people study in their leisure time their family history. And also it has led to the rise of independent genealogists helping these people. And now it has led to private companies who do research and also provide DNA testing. And that is almost symbolized or shown very beautifully by the emergence in this recent census of that time capsule, which has nothing to do with the collection of statistics or the public realm. It's all to do with saying what your pet was called or whatever, so that somebody in 100 years' time will see that. That has nothing to do with the age of political economy. That is to do with the independent, private researcher and our own personal whims, likes and dislikes, etc., etc. So that is the rise of the individual researcher who's seeking personal information for essentially leisure or even touristic purposes. And that has happened in the last 20 or 30 years. But also, this period has seen the rise of another type of researcher, another type of personal researcher. And that is individuals who have been victims of this state, victims of state institutions and the voluntary sector employed by the state, who now require knowledge about their backgrounds and redress from the system and wider society. And this has impacts laws regarding privacy, what should be in the Public Records Office, what should be in the private realm, what should be in the public domain. So fortunately now, the plight of these individuals are now at last to be addressed. And there's going to be a revision of the National Archives Act, establishment of a centre of remembrance and research where records can be accessed digitally. So this is good news, but one of the issues then this brings into the fore is this whole big issue of can this need be addressed in a decent time frame because of the government's and this state's issues with public procurement, which is a huge issue. So finally, I'd like to give my own personal view. So I've outlined my 3 eras there of the 3 points of the historian's lecture, as it were. So as a professional historian, I've researched in archives in Northern Ireland, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and the Vatican, as well as here in the Republic of Ireland. The archives here, notwithstanding the extraordinary commitment of the staff, are a skeleton service compared to what exists elsewhere. The National Archives of Ireland have shown what a fantastic difference it can make to Irish life over the last 10 years of the commemorations. With a series of exhibitions, Joe and Orlaith have just mentioned the treaty exhibition, a fantastic piece of work, and also contributions in all manner of ways, like, for instance, the conservation work being undertaken by the National Archives, like a one-person operation assisted by a number of part-time workers. Extraordinary work. But despite all that, this is a seriously underfunded institution, under-resourced and understaffed in comparison to similar institutions elsewhere in the world. For instance, in 1990, I worked in an old medieval archive in the basement of the Parliament building in Lisbon. When I was back 20 years later, the Portuguese archives had been centralised in a custom-built, pyramid-shaped edifice, maybe even a ziggurat, Joan, in a parkland area beside the university. It was a pleasure to work in that institution. Here, we're having difficulty because of rocketing building costs of even expanding and renovating the National Archives repository to meet the current needs, which are, of course, now including a lot of born digital material. And that will be increasingly the case. And perhaps, to follow up what Natalie says here, perhaps, in fact, we should go completely digital. Scan all the government records, conserve everything we can, and have the stuff accessed from a data centre in the Midlands. But then who would control access to that archive? And that's an intriguing question. The irony of this thing is bizarrely one pointed towards by the soon-to-be-opened virtual record Treasure of Ireland, because it attempts to recreate online what was destroyed 100 years ago, the records of the original Public Record Office of Ireland.
Well, thank you very much, Hiram. That's a very interesting take on the historian and the National Archives. Dr. Elizabeth Mullins is an archivist and historian. She leads the Archives and Records Management Training Programme in the School of History in University College Dublin. So, Liz, you certainly know how far we've come from the clay tablets. And so could I ask you, how has the profession developed in Ireland since 1922? And what are the distinctive aspects of the work of the archivist?
Great. Thanks, John. And I just wanted to say thanks to everyone again for being here. It's actually really kind of moving to be in this room at the moment. And I really have a sense of the archivists who were here in 1922, just from your speech, John, them coming in and seeing what it must have been incredibly it must have been just terrible for them coming into this kind of ruin. So it's actually wonderful to be here, to be able to honour them and what they did. So just to talk about your question, so I think in terms of how the archival profession has developed since 1922, a really key moment was the establishment in 1972, so exactly 50 years ago this year, of the first archival training programmes in the country. And these were established by a really extraordinary woman called Kerry Holland. And Kerry led archival training in the country for the next 40 years. So she's a kind of remarkable person. But Kerry's work was really supported by other archivists in UCD and in the country, but also really importantly by academic historians. So people like Robert Dudley Edwards and T.W. Moody, who had trained in the UK and who really saw the value of having people with professional archival skills minding the records of the state. And so since the beginning of archival training in 1972, when it was just one programme added into a library training, the courses have expanded to standalone programmes, and we run them now at certificate, master's and doctoral level. And what's really important is that the programmes are professionally accredited by the UK and Irish Archives and Records Association. And what that means is that Irish archivists are trained to international best practice standards, but it also allows us to connect out. And so what we've had a sense this evening, I think, of how important it is for archivists to think about the kind of challenges and opportunities of archives and records in a global sense. So things like born digital records that Natalie talked about, and increasingly now archivists internationally are thinking about adopting new approaches to how we present records to people, so adopting more person-centred approaches that think about the subject of the record and think about the user of the record and what they're bringing to records. And the other thing, which is important, I guess, about connecting internationally, is that it also allows us to think about archives in relation to global challenges. So where do we fit in terms of climate change? What happens with archives and records in times of war, like what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. So just to go back, I guess, a little bit to the first question, John, about how the profession of the archivist has changed. I think a really good way of thinking about it is to think about it moving from quite a passive role, where we were really supporting the work of academic historians, to a much more active role now. So as archivists, we talk about a move kind of through from evidence to memory to identity to engaging with communities and individuals. And that means that while we value archives hugely we value our relationship with academic historians hugely, we also think about the archives as holding the histories of everybody. So Hiram, your point about the census was brilliant in terms of we're now able to put our own history into the public record. But archives are also really important as evidence. Okay, so that came through in your talk, John, in terms of transparency, accountability, and especially human rights. And so there's a much kind of a broader role for the archivist and a much more active role for the archivist. So just then to think about the second part of the question is about, this is what I spend my time doing, how do you train people to actually fulfill this role? So the first thing to say, actually, and this might surprise people, is that we don't require people to have a background in history to train to be an archivist. And that's while we get lots and lots of graduates coming to us with that, The important thing to remember, I guess, is that every organisation creates archives. So you have archives in banks and in businesses and in fashion houses. And sometimes it can be great for us to have people coming in from those backgrounds who have specialist knowledge and combining that then with how to manage records. And even in a context like the National Archives, I guess it's the same, where you're dealing with such a range of records that you want people, I guess you're drawing on a whole world of information that's created. But I think there's really two things that we try to teach people when they're training to be archivists. And their records are created to answer the needs of the present, okay? And what archivists have to do is understand that context and preserve it moving forward. And so the first thing we try to do is to get people to think about the qualities of records. So what makes us trust a record? And so Natalie, for example, talked about email or a Word document that I can go in and change 20 times. So how do I know long term that we can trust those records? How do we ensure that it remains authentic and that it can be evidenced 100 years into the future? But while we think about the qualities of individual records, the really, I think, distinctive kind of part of an archival approach is that we think about records as part of collections. We approach records in their context. And this is really important because it allows us to understand why the records were created at a particular time, and also to explore the power dynamics in those records. So who created them? What do they want to happen with the records? And why then are some people left out of the records? Why are some voices more silent? Kind of alluding a little bit to what Natalie was talking about there, that records aren't just created by the state. So where might there be other records that archivists can look after? And so those two things together, the idea of the qualities of the record and the context of the records, archivists try to apply that to every stage of their work. So with digital records, we apply it to thinking about the creation of records. What needs to be there so a Word document or an email is authentic? And then to the appraisal of records. So what records are the ones that are valuable? How can we make that decision? Are we missing out on records? We use it to create the frame around records. So the kind of catalogues that John talked about, the finding aids, they're the ways that archivists wrap the content of the records in context. There's a great archival theorist called Terry Cook who always said that we're not just about providing people with information, you're actually providing people with the means to knowledge and understanding. And that's what the kind of skill of the archivist is. And then now, particularly in the online environment where people are coming to access records without them physically meeting an archivist, we have to be imaginative, I guess, about how we present our material on our websites so that people can get that understanding. So I think that's it, John.
Thanks very much, Liz. That is very interesting. Well, of course, as always, time is the great enemy, and we're nearly out of time. I have time for one question. I have a question from Ciara Brannock. Ciara, would you like to ask your question?
I'll just take up on that for a moment. First of all, I just want to First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful contributions this evening, and I'd also like to echo what Liz said. You know, it's a real poignant thing for both myself and Ciarán sitting here beside me as historians to be in this room. One thing that really strikes me this evening is, first of all, I'm going to refer to the Forsa report in 2018, which indicated that Ireland's archival staff, National Archives archival staff, was at 40% of the Danish National Archives, which is deeply troubling. And I'm filled with a sense of dread as we come to the end of the decade of centenaries. And, you know, are we going to have another 30 years of neglect? And are you also, we're also aware from this evening's contributions that we have two waves of records to look after. We have the material ones, but it's something that really strikes me this evening, that are we in danger now of losing momentum, and the government and civil servants thinking that we have enough with the investment in the new repository. So that's all for me. And
Well, thank you very much, Ciara. Look, I think we'll just take that as a comment, if not indeed a cri de cœur, and take that on board. So, look, thank you to everyone who's been involved tonight. Thank you again to the Chief Justice for coming along and honouring us with his presence here, and also thanks to all who've been involved in organising it in the courts, on the court service side, on the National Archives side, and our IT people who've done a very fine job here this evening. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the members of the National Archives Advisory Council. They serve pro bono. They've been serving now for 5 years. They're just coming to the end of the term. They have given selflessly of their time and expertise over those last 5 years, and for me it's been inspirational to work with them all. We've also got tremendous support from the National Archives, from the director, and from John McDonough, the predecessor of Orla, and from the other staff who've come along and talked to us and given freely of their time. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry we didn't get to have the chance to have more questions, but all I can do is just wish you all a very good evening.